Hello, Todd. Good afternoon, and thank you to all of you for joining us, and thank you, Todd, for participating in this conversation.
It's great to be here.
So you are a composer, you're an inventor, you've developed software, but for the past 3 decades, you have been a professor of music and media at the MIT Media Lab. What does that mean?
Well, the Media Lab itself is unusual. Actually, MIT's we were just talking about Harvard and MIT, which are right next to each other. So MIT was started around the time of the Civil War, and it isn't like a normal university. It's an inventive place. And the Media Lab is the part of MIT which has really been given the mission of finding ways to improve quality of life for people, no matter in what area or in what way. And when I first went to the Media Lab, they actually called me and said, would you be interested? And they said, we have this incredibly interdisciplinary place, like more interdisciplinary than you can imagine. Now we call it anti-disciplinary, actually. And we're interested in the areas between defined fields as being the places where interesting things happen. So for music, I was trained as a composer, as a cellist. My mom's a pianist. My dad was a technologist. So I grew up with both of these things. And the Media Lab has been a great place to think about music with no traditional definitions about what music has to be, who it's for, what it sounds like, how you make it. And so music and media really means professor of thinking about music and all of its possible implications. And I think we've tended to do that.
Wow. So one of the initiatives that we're going to hear a little bit from this afternoon is something called the City Symphonies. And my understanding, you've done this in a number of different cities around the world, including here in Detroit.
This one, yeah.
You've gone to these cities, you've collected sounds from the city, you've gotten a feel for the sound of the place, and have turned those sounds, working with members of the community, into a symphony. So I want to hear a little bit about the process of doing that, about transforming sounds from a place into a symphony, inspired by a place. And we're going to hear a few clips about that in a second. But one of those symphonies was, as I mentioned, done here in Detroit. How did that start? What was your process like from the beginning?
Right, so the very first of these was, you told me a little while ago you're from Toronto, and the first of these symphonies, the symphony had simply asked me to write a symphony. They knew me, so they asked me because they knew I would propose something unusual.
Yeah.
So I said, I'd love to do that, of course. I'd like to make you the Toronto Symphony. I'd like to make a sonic portrait of Toronto. I'd like to use normal music, but I'd also like to listen to the city and to see what it is about Toronto that makes it feel this way, and I'd like to incorporate those sounds. And I'd like to ask everybody in the city to collaborate with me to make this, because they know the city, and it's a great way to have people think together. The people who were in charge of the Knight Foundation, actually, Alberto Ibargüen spoke this morning. Yeah. Dennis Scholl, who was head of the arts, heard about the project in Toronto, and he said, that's amazing. And after the Toronto project, we got requests from all around the world, but not yet from the States. And so Dennis Scholl got in touch with me and said, we should really bring this to the States. The Knight Foundation is present in a lot of cities. Here's a list. Actually, I remember Dennis said, which city would you like to do this in? But you should pick Detroit, is what he said. And so we talked to the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. They said, we'd love to do this. And when I did the project in Toronto, I was really kind of surprised when the Toronto Symphony said, okay, let's do this. Let's invite the whole city to participate, because we had no idea how to do it. And so when I went into Toronto, I came in with some material. I made some sounds and some chords, and I had kind of a story in my mind about a symphony that was about exploring a city and finding out what it was like. That was kind of the story of the piece. And that helped me find my way. When I came to Detroit, I'd learned that the most exciting thing is to come into a city with absolutely no preconception about what the city is, what story should be told, what it sounds like, who's there. And so in Detroit, it was so frightening. I didn't know the city all that well, and I came here really knowing that there was a deadline for producing this, knowing that I wanted to find out as much as possible, get people involved, but knowing that I would just have to see what showed up.
Wow. All right. Well, let's actually listen together to a few sounds of the city. We're going to listen first to a brief clip, just to some sounds of life out and about that I believe were all taken here
Yes.
in Detroit. If you'll play the first video. So that is quite a mix of different types of sounds from a whole variety of different activities, from ice skating to pouring rice.
That's popcorn. That sound is great, isn't it?
Corn.
I like that.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
What makes a sound notable or distinctive? How do you listen to the cacophony of urban life and choose from it things that feel resonant or representative?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to say is that we're so trained, we're so visually oriented these days. You know, we see things on screens all the time, little screens, big screens, and we get around the world mostly by looking at things. And we forget how sensitive our hearing is. And what's so incredible about hearing is that we take in the sound around us. We don't have eyelids on our ears, so we can't turn off the sound. And usually when we go through a city, let alone when we're in a room with lots of people, we usually consciously we focus on something, but there's so much else going on. And so one thing, I mean, I kind of knew this. Probably most of you have heard of John Cage, who was one of the great American composers in the 20th century. And he's the one who wrote this famous piece called 4 minutes, 33 seconds, where a pianist comes on stage, opens the lid of the piano, and sits there doing nothing for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. It was a scan, and it's published, you can buy the music, and there are many recordings of it, actually. Every once in a while, you'll see, my interpretation of John Cage's 4 minutes.
It's actually a great performance.
It was.
I mean, it's great.
It is, and of course, what he was saying, he was very radical. What he was saying is, it was not just a comment on what music is, but also on what composers were. He said, if we could all just listen to the sounds around us and hear the complexity and the beauty, and that we wouldn't need composers, that the music is there. What I learned is that there is incredible sound. You can find it, you can learn to listen to it. There's so many things going on at once. It tells you stories, but just as pure sound, it's beautiful. And then if you think about combining it, if you think about it as material for music, you can do remarkable things with it.
So the next couple of clips we're going to hear kind of ladder up to from an individual sound, an isolated sound, to its appearance in the symphony. So let's hear the first clip. And this one's one you really just listen to it, because you're going to hear this sound again in a moment. Feel it. What is that sound? What were we just listening to?
So, not surprisingly, when I came to Detroit, one of the first things I realized is how profound the industrial history is here, and also how much the industrial culture and even the sound of it changed over a pretty short amount of time. So that was the very, very first engine that Henry Ford ever built. It's called the kitchen engine. He built it in his kitchen, and it's here at the Henry Ford Museum. And what struck me about, actually, at the beginning of that sound, you wonder, is the thing gonna start? It's like, but to me it sounded not at all like what I imagined a Ford car plant to sound like. It sounds very delicate, actually, and to me it was like the chamber music of engines, and every little, it's. I remember when we went there was somebody who had to prime the engine, and it was sputtering. He had to change the amount of oil that was put in and change the dosage of air. It was very, and so that made for this delicate, complex sound, which evolves. And actually, it was, since it was the first engine that started the whole, the Ford, the idea of an assembly line and a big factory. the entire, we'll hear in a minute, I think, the entire symphony that I wrote for Detroit actually starts with this sound that's purely the engine, and then the orchestra takes over the engine.
So let's hear it. Let's hear that sound again in the beginning of Symphony in D. For a sound like that, for other pieces that you've done, so you did a symphony in Philadelphia, for example, and one of the sounds that was described as being recognizable by many in the audience was the sizzling of the Philly cheesesteak.
Is this correct?
Yes.
Made the front page of the New York Times, actually, the cheesesteak in Carnegie Hall. You know,
And using a sound like that, obviously you might be going for a little blush of recognition, of identifying with this sound that seems so familiar and is so baked into the everyday life of this place.
Yep.
With that kitchen engine that we heard, that engine from Henry Ford, that's a sound that's more obscure. It's a sound from history. It's kind of baked into the fabric of a place, but it's deeper. What are you trying to evoke when you use a sound like that in a symphony?
Oh, it's a great question. So you're absolutely right. There's a huge range of when a sound is recognizable, when it's just interesting in itself. And actually, a minute ago, you said what makes a sound interesting. I think the two things are there has to be something intrinsic in it. So there has to be something that if you had no idea what it was, if you came from another country and came to a city, didn't know the city, you would listen to that and say, oh my gosh, that captured my ear. They're like an instrumentalist playing a beautiful melody. And then there are sounds which you want to use because they're recognizable. The problem with things that are very recognizable is that they can easily become cliches. And so, for instance, with the cheesesteaks, I made a solo for the cheesesteak. The orchestra plays, and then all of a sudden it settles down, and you hear, and everybody in Philadelphia laughed because they knew exactly what it was. But once you do that, then you have to turn it into something else. So for instance, here, probably most people who heard it didn't know it was the kitchen engine, but everybody would have known it was an engine, and everybody would have known it was kind of an unusual engine. It doesn't sound like a modern car exactly. It doesn't sound like a lawnmower. You're not quite sure what it is. But you hear this thing which is clearly industrial. And then as you can see at the end of that clip, I wrote it so that the musicians, the violins are playing a melody, but all the percussionists actually take that sound, and little by little the engine disappears, and the sound of the engine is played by this whole battery of, we had to find all kinds of special things that they could hit and touch and to take over that sound and make it musical.
Now, you incorporate not only just sounds from the urban environment, but also members of the community in some cases. So this clip that we're going to see, the last clip from Symphony in D that we're going to see, includes a member of the community speaking at the outset. Let's
actually, I'll just say one quick thing, which is really you don't know in each city what you're going to find, what the story is. Of course, the story in Detroit had so much to do with musically how the sound of factories ended up in bass lines of music and ended up in Motown and techno. And, but it also had to do with the resurgence of the city and what it takes to, you know, be a Detroiter and what the future is. But I remember I'd almost finished the piece. The orchestra was, you know, saying, "Where's our music? Where's our music?" And I came to Detroit, and I realized one day that of all the sounds, everything I discovered in Detroit, the most incredible thing that I'd found here were the people I'd met. And, you know, all kinds, from little kids to, there was a whole group of seniors in town who offered to collect the sounds of Detroit that had disappeared and to represent those in the, I mean, unbelievable things, from famous people to ordinary people. And I remember I called the president of the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, and I said, you know, you're going to kill me because I know that the piece is supposed to be done, but I just realized that the most valuable thing here are the people, and I would love to select some of the most special people I've met here and make them part of the piece. And I'd love to have them, some of them write texts, and some of them play music, and I'd like them on stage with the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. And bless her heart, she said, I get it, let's do it. And so what we're going to see now is something from near the end of the piece. Reciting a poem is written specially for this is Tanya Matthews, who I think still is the head of the Science Museum here, but she's also a PhD in biology and a performance artist. And then you'll notice the orchestra, but all kinds of performers from all kinds of different backgrounds who I invited to be part of this.
Yeah, so use your eyes and your ears on this one. Look at what you see on stage and listen to all the elements. Let's hear this last clip from Symphony in D.
If you can't see, we are not done yet. If you don't recognize the genius in refusing to be generic, if you still can't tell the difference between the boom and the bass, you've never been to Detroit. But don't worry, we'll still be here when you decide to learn.
One of my favorite details, over in the front, there's this little band of like 4 or 5 kids, and this little girl just starts swinging the arm of the adult that's holding her hand. And it just, looking at that, I'm curious, how logistically did you make that happen? I mean, how did you bring those performers together to make something cohesive?
Yeah, so it wasn't easy. They're crazy projects. So there's so many ways to answer that. One is kind of musically and artistically, and in some ways that's the most fun, but it's also the hardest because you're coming to a place, you don't know who you're going to meet, you don't know, I met so many musicians. I mean, so the idea of musically how it fits together evolves little by little. And I remember in Detroit, one of the things that somebody said to me early on in the project was, bring all these things together in Detroit, but make sure that the resolution isn't so simple, because, it's not so simple here. And I kept that in mind, the idea that, it's amazing, there's so much strength and enthusiasm and optimism here, but there's so many layers. It's not, so you couldn't resolve it simply. So there's a kind of complexity in this piece and a strength and a roughness that isn't in all the other pieces. But like any other piece, I try to find melodies and harmonies and rhythms, things that tie all this together. Some of it comes from the material, some of it comes from in here and from people we work with. And logistically, it's really hard. I mean, writing a piece with very unusual material and sounds for a symphony orchestra already is difficult because, these are great orchestras, but they usually don't have a lot of rehearsal time. So something I've had to learn over the years is how to make things which are kind of strange that people can absorb quickly. When you then get all these people from the community who, some read music, some don't read music, some can follow a conductor, some can't follow a conductor. It
strikes me as almost a metaphor for getting a bunch of different people in a city to work together.
Well, that's what's so fun about, but it is, and I think so many people, collaborate and meet through a project like this. They're friendships and even kind of groups that do things together now because of this project and projects like it. I think it's one of the reasons to do it.
We are going to hear 2 more clips. We asked participants in CityLab to submit sounds from the places that you inhabit or have visited. So we're going to hear 2 of those sounds, and we'll just play them back to back. Let's hear the first. Let's hear this.
I could feel that sound.
Yes, I know. I said 2 senses, but you're using 3, obviously. So the first of those was from a seaplane taking off from the
Weren't we gonna have them guess?
Anchorage. Yeah, were you gonna guess that? Yeah. Anchorage seaplane takeoff. And the second of those was from a celebration in Beersheba in Israel, where the soccer team had won the state championship 3 years in a row after a 3-decade drought. You having a World Series victory last night will recognize that sound also, probably.
I absolutely did, but apropos, I watched the World Series last night. I'm from Boston, so it was really exciting. And there's certain, you take a stadium, there's certain things about kind of every large crowd that's kind of the same, but there's something very, very different. In the Beersheba clip, for instance, the fact that you could hear at the beginning, you could hear kind of individuals commenting on their joy to see what was happening. There were like groups, but then there was kind of a band and a song where everybody joined in, and this clip that was sent kind of went between these sort of individual spontaneous reactions and then kind of the whole crowd doing something together, which is very different than what happens at a US sporting event.
Yeah.
Where it's kind of individual no matter what.
Wow. Well, you can listen to all of the clips submitted by your fellow participants at our interactive exhibit, The Sonic City, out in the hall at your next break. But meanwhile, Tod, thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt. Pleasure.